Hi, everyone. My name's Haley Baker, and my research paper topic is music teachers and directors' attitudes and perceptions toward teaching students with autism spectrum disorder. And I plan on doing a mock qualitative study proposal to hopefully use for my capstone next semester. So some of my guided research questions were, how do music teachers and directors view their own effectiveness in teaching students with autism spectrum disorder? And I really want this to be the main focus of my paper because I really feel like disabilities in the music education classroom, of course, is always evolving with different research and things. So I found a study that was done 20 years ago, and Van Welden and Whipple took this study from 20 years prior and decided to re-go over the information because they felt like maybe the survey that the three researchers did 20 years ago was probably outdated due to things like undergraduates having access to courses for special education and music education, things like professional development, just overall changes in the special education field and things like that. And this survey was done with SurveyMonkey. So this was sent out to a bunch of different directors, and the ones that did respond, 98% of them said that students with special needs took or elected to take music courses. And this was open to everybody K through 12. So this is encompassing general music, band, choir, any sort of performance or non-performance based music class. And of those participants, 61% felt that students' music education needs were met in general music. So this is part of the research paper too, kind of looked at whether students should be receiving music education either in like their special ed classrooms or out mixed with the general population. And so 61% of them felt that they were being met in general music, being inclusive environment. 53% of them, though, felt that students' music education needs were met in ensembles. So, stepping outside of music education in a general setting, that number kind of went down in ensembles to nearly almost half. And then of this group, 52% felt students with autism spectrum disorder did not achieve the same level of music achievement as their peers. So kind of looking at that data, I also found another research student or research project done by Smith and Wilson, specifically on music graduate students. So these were graduate students going toward a degree in music education, like some of us are. And out of that um, graduate student population, they also took a look at student teacher surveys. So these are pre-service undergraduate students getting ready to teach after student teaching. And of course, the majority of them did not feel comfortable um, going into the field, but also too, the graduate students and the student teachers both felt even more uncomfortable with working with students with special needs or with autism spectrum disorder after the class. And looking at the research, a lot of that was based on how much they ended up learning in the class, and it kind of opened up the known unknowns. If you ever heard that expression before, the more that they learned about it, the more that they realized that they didn't know about it, and how many strategies there are behind it, and how uncomfortable they actually felt doing it. Um, the class that the graduate students took in this survey was called Music for the Special Learner, and it was a 7-week summer course where there was no like one-on-one field work or like any kind of a component like that, but just 7 weeks of a lecture-based course, and students were asked before the course and after the course about their attitudes and comfortability with working with students with special needs and with autism spectrum disorder. So Smith and Wilson ended up using a 5-point Likert scale. And out of that 5-point Likert scale, 18 graduate students that were in the summer course were asked in different categories in different scenarios, one being least comfortable and five being the most comfortable. How comfortable they would be working with students with like Down syndrome, with traumatic brain injury, and then one of the categories was working with a student with autism. So overall, the students on this Likert scale ranked 2.29 out of 5 points for past experiences with students with disabilities. So this was their comfort level, just kind of coming into this course. They felt about a 2.29 out of 5 for how comfortable they were with working with students with disabilities. And specifically on the question on the survey, you can see on my last point here, the question or the scenario was a 9-year-old boy diagnosed as autistic. And then the graduate students were asked on a 5-point Likert scale how comfortable they would be with working with a student, a 9-year-old boy diagnosed as autistic. So before they took the 7-week course, the average was a 2.5 out of 5 for how comfortable they would be. And then after the course, it only went up to 3.47. So I was kind of surprised about the little point amount that it went up after the course. Um, and out of the 8 disability scenarios, like I said, it was like traumatic brain injury, working with like a student with ADHD, working with a student with just like a generalized need, um, and other disabilities. Working with a student with autism was actually, believe it was the next to lowest ranking out of the 8 disability scenarios. So even after they took this course, specifically students with autism, they felt the least comfortable with working with them, which I found to be really interesting. Um, Another one of my questions, my research questions was, do music teachers and directors feel as though their college preparation program included enough information about teaching students with autism spectrum disorder? So thinking about even before they get out into the field, the preparation with that. So I found uh, a study done by this researcher, and he found that in his belief before the research, and it was solidified through the research, that limited contact of a pre-service teacher equals the preconceived attitudes that the teachers seem to have with working with students with autism spectrum disorder. So, I mean, that made sense to me. Like, like the more experience you have, the less of a preconceived attitude you can have because you have more experience. But the more uncomfortable and the less experience they seem to have, they had kind of these preconceived attitudes and biases toward working with students with autism spectrum disorder. And his research found that it was really due to the lack of coursework in their undergraduate work and the coursework outside of the music school. So both like not having enough special needs and music education classes within their actual work, but also too they found that just like the field work, there wasn't enough field work opportunities with students with special needs. And a lot of undergrads in this study found to be that they had zero field work experience with special needs outside of their coursework at all. So this researcher followed 2 undergraduate students that served as aides to students with exceptionalities in a band setting. One student had autism and another one had a traumatic brain injury. Um, and specifically with the one with the traumatic brain injury, they interviewed the band director and the mother of the student with the traumatic brain injury before this research. And the band director was really against having these students come in as aides for this researcher to be able to explore this opportunity to further research in this topic. But the mother of the student actually really pushed for it and felt like there was not enough resources for teachers to be able to help people like her son, and the mother ended up actually convincing the band director to let these students and this researcher come in and explore these opportunities. So the 2 students that were part of this study, the undergraduate students that served as an aide to these students, took journals. And all of the research on this study was based off of these journals of these undergraduate students, but also the band director had a journal, the mother of the student had a journal, and even the student with the traumatic brain injury had a journal, which to me was interesting. But the more I read the article, I guess the English teacher at the school was really invested in this research as well and ended up wanting to help out and helped him write his article about his perspective about working with these students, which I thought was really cool because a lot of these research articles that I've been reading include all about like the researchers' perspectives and the teachers' perspectives, but none of them included the students themselves and their perspectives of being a music class. So I felt like it was really important to include this study, even though it wasn't directly linked to autism, because the student had traumatic brain injury. I thought maybe it would just be cool to try to include something that actually had a perspective of the special needs student. And so The researcher went through all these journal entries of the undergrad students, the student himself, the mother, and the band director, and found that all of them were definitely anxious about the study at first, especially the student aides and especially the band director. The band director admitted that he only had like one class in his undergraduate work and honestly did not feel comfortable and did not feel like he was meeting the needs of the student, even though he was trying the best that he can. And the undergraduate students were really wanting to put themselves out there to work in this scenario because they knew that they didn't have enough prior education on this topic. But the mother was absolutely stoked, and of course, I understand why. But um, the undergraduate students in a lot of their journals kept like logging about how once they like built rapport with the student and they started to understand the student more, the more comfortable they were. And I think one of the student aides wrote in his journal on like the second or third entry, he was like, "Oh, once I really found out how to communicate with him, all of my anxiety went away. Like, I found a way of communication, really breaking it down, kind of keeping a more, I don't wanna say simple wording, but a more straightforward wording of things." And he really found a way to connect and communicate with that student, and he said that was an absolute game changer. Um, and so I felt like that was really important toward my research on this topic as well. Um, and this is the part where I'm not sure whether to include this in my paper or not because it's more about the preconceived notions or perspectives or like how directors and teachers feel like their overall effectiveness is with working with students with autism spectrum disorder. But I felt like it would be kind of nice to in summary, as I'm summarizing all the research that I found and different things like that, to kind of include what research says is the best practices for working with students with autism spectrum disorder in the music classroom, because I feel like it's definitely a topic. Although it's gaining more traction and more attention in recent years, I feel like a lot of us don't have nearly enough experience and knowledge on this topic. So some things to consider with that based on these articles that I've been reading are students with autism spectrum disorder struggle with the emotional intent of others, interpreting emotions and body language. So in music, of course, that's super important. We're trying to like talk about all this expressiveness and emotion and moving with our body to the music and trying to communicate those types of feelings. Also, keeping in mind in our toolkit that we need to have more concrete, straightforward strategies for our students with special needs in there. Um, they also have difficulty organizing information. So, I read a lot about this choir teacher and how she struggled to have the student like understand what the song that they were singing about was. So she had like pictures with the song. So like as they were singing about it, she would hold up the different picture flashcards or have the student follow along with their flashcards. That way they could piece together what they were singing about, which I thought was really cool. Um, and yeah, like about how they have trouble like connecting different segments of information to them. Everything's kind of compartmentalized. So keeping that in mind that maybe these big picture things that we're asking them about may be more difficult and being prepared to have more concrete strategies with that. And also a big one, visual adaptations and task analysis lists. Um, for the task analysis list, they had examples of like, let's say a beginning band student was coming in to set up their flute. So the director would have pictures of like step one, you need to do this. And it would be like a picture of a student with a case on their lap. And then, step two, like open the case, and the picture would have the case open, and so on and so forth. That way, it's just another like visual representation of what they need to do to keep them on track. Um, and then just having an overall positive classroom environment, which we should always be striving for anyway, but especially encouraging for students with autism spectrum disorder that may be stepping out of their comfort zone into something that would really benefit them. Um, so yeah, overall, as I continue to finish my paper, I hope to kind of wrap some of these sources up together, maybe kind of find a few new ones, and really, really focus on these preconceived notions and ideas that directors have with working with students with autism spectrum disorder, and really diving into why. So based on like not having enough coursework in their undergraduate work, maybe just not having enough experience, not having enough knowledge, And I just found it really interesting, all the like this research study with the Likert scale, finding that taking even just one course was able to increase it from a 2.5 to a 3.47. So just continuing to have those professional development opportunities, graduate coursework, and really honing in on having undergraduate students have a chance to get out into the field, like those two students volunteered to do, to be an aide to that student with traumatic brain injury. Um, Thank you guys so much. I hope everybody's final papers go well, and I hope you guys all have a good holiday season. Thank you.